In the past few months, the internet was dominated by the arrival of Puss in Boots, and as a result, multiple DreamWorks vs Disney memes that have spawned highlighting a superior quality of animation and storytelling when Disney has slipped up. And of course, that is something we could fully agree on, that Puss has been a better story than the lackluster quality in animation that Disney had, but this has been an argument since its very founding, where I find a need to expand upon it because only now, when they have released this, and of course the recent Ruby Gillman trailer, that most people think that everything that DreamWorks is doing is pointing fun at what Disney has doing and whatnot, where newer generations are just finding what this company was virtually founded on. The studio, founded by the embittered ex-Disney executive Jeffrey Katzenberg, who I actually despise on a lot of things, where of course at the very least I can appreciate the films that he's given us to rival the animation and live action departments of Disney in the 90s and early 2000s. And the point of this video is to highlight the highs and lows of both companies, what they are doing right and wrong in their animation in their past and future, and the concerns that I actually have of both, leaning towards the optimistic outcome of DreamWorks' upcoming projects and the uneasy feeling of what Disney has attempted to do, focusing on turning everything from 2D and now 3D into soulless live action and whatnot. The history of DreamWorks is unique, beginning again to be counteracting Disney and Pixar to the extent with the likes of Ants, their very first film, which was 3D, with like Toy Story itself was for Pixar, and one that was actually released under the background of a public feud between Katzenberg and Pixar because of A Bug's Life that was released during the same year. And Bug's Life was a bit more well known in the public at the time from what I hear, where they were upset at this beginning and thus began this public feud up until their releases, which were literally months within each other, thus beginning the true seeds of what we are seeing present today within the films. And of course, actually both of them are good, where I actually prefer Bug's Life due to my Pixar favoritism during my youth. It's just that the quality was actually there in Bug's Life and it offered a little bit more variety than what Ants actually did. What was also wild about this time is that the DreamWorks also released another film a month after Bug's Life, being The Prince of Egypt, which I consider to be today one of the greatest animated films ever released, and it really showed. This was the film that could be enjoyed by all people of either faith, either non-religious or atheist, over the story of the Book of Exodus about Moses up until the 10 Commandments came in. It was one that proved DreamWorks' ability on their own that could compete to Disney to their very standards, a time where they all did the traditional animation, which I consider to be another loss proven with the release of Shrek and the bombs later on with Sinbad, that these were the only traditional animation that they would ever do, where I really thought they were good at it and could have continued in later on, but then yet again they wouldn't have been quite successful as today without it. And this was still during the time of the midst of the Disney Renaissance, with the successful films like Mulan, Hercules, Tarzan released during the same years, which overshadowed the productions like Road to El Dorado, which was another underrated classic, and then again Spirit, a film that was a box office disappointment that somehow got a standalone sequel in 2021 in 3D animation, which also sucked too, where they also had a prequel to The Prince of Egypt during this time, only released on direct-to-DVD based off the count from the Book of Genesis, where of course it just showed no matter how hard they tried to commit to this animation style, it just couldn't work compared to the likes of Disney's disappointments like Atlantis, where at least most people actually knew that they had it in them with The Emperor's New Groove and Lilo and Stitch, where they then decided to release Shrek, where it would change everything we knew about DreamWorks. Because here was a film that really shaked up everything about the typical fairy tale tropes, and I'm not going to talk about the history of the production, but the release of the film in regard of what it showed. Because compared to Ants, this was the real film that showed that they could compete with Pixar and by extent Disney as they started to capitalize off of this new animation, where as we know, Disney actually sabotaged their other films to seeing how popular this could actually be for them. Because this was the first film that really became a parody of the classic Disney fairy tales that we'd see predominantly in this very series later on, and the main formula of what most DreamWorks adaptations would be about, where Disney would be more serious in their stories, DreamWorks would actually be more loose and more parody-like, which would actually end their traditional animation because of the disappointments of Sinbad being the last one that closed the door for good, but opening door for great films like Shrek 2, which amazingly continued the greatness of the first film and proved that they were much better at handling sequels than Disney ever could, especially with the likes of their direct-to-DVDs at the time. And the thing that makes them unique is how they don't try to be better than Disney now. At this time, they tried it at first with traditional animation, but apparently that didn't work for them, where they found themselves making something more parody-oriented that still had a serious story at heart. Where of course, in compared to Pixar and Disney, you know you have that typical fun adventures, but mainly they put these serious great lessons behind it, where DreamWorks just like to be let loose and have fun with their messages and whatnot, where they can either work to the extent of the greatest ones or fail to mere utter boredom like Shark Tale. To be fair, also during the same time, Disney actually released their first 3D films like Chicken Little, and of course their last 2Ds like Home on the Range, which are far from good in any way today, but also still had Pixar releasing classics like The Incredibles to make up for it, where leaning heavily into one side actually destroyed the purpose of films like Shark Tale, and the same thing happened again with the release of B-Movie, which I consider to be one of the worst animated movies of all time, because words cannot express how much I hate the plot of what the film is derived from, a bee suing the human race. But beyond that, what I liked about DreamWorks is incorporating these distinct styles from each other during this time that Disney was diving new into this more style and sticking to it with what we know they use today, with the likes of Bolt, Tangled, and where Princess and the Frog was the last traditional animated film that they have ever released. Where despite in the case of DreamWorks perceived as failure, Disney never waned from this type of style of film with the success of Princess and the Frog, and still could continue using the style as of today, even though they pushed for something more safe along the centuries that continued. Because I always had appreciation for what Flushed Away brought, especially Kung Fu Panda 2, with those sequences of 2D animation that blends well with the 3D, which we would see later on. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love these stories in Tangled, Ralph, and Frozen, but I do more appreciate the willingness in DreamWorks' case to dive more into this variety of fields to tell stories that can either be good or bad, but even DreamWorks can come under their own sequel curses and whatnot, with the likes of Shrek the Third and the Madagascar spin-offs, with the Boss Baby intros just being vehemently terrible in my opinion, proving that not everything would always work for either studio. Because once again, during this time, Disney would actually still find that edge in storytelling with this new predominant style, while DreamWorks was actually trying to reassert themselves after the highs of Megamind, doing multiple things that weren't as great as their early 2000s success. Most of them during this period were very mediocre, like Turbo and of course Trolls, with the exception of things like Kung Fu Panda being great during that same time frame. And the interesting thing about these companies is how they constantly go through these weird phases where they can find the right stories until the money is put into question, either in both box office failures or successes that tell the greed of either both Disney or DreamWorks in that regard. How they can find their highs and lows from each other with what we are seeing today. Because this brings us to the back of the state of modern times, with 2022 really bringing the new comeback point for DreamWorks against Disney, where we've started to notice the problems that I've talked about previously, notably in Disney films removing the important part of the stories in their villains, where DreamWorks did nothing but mainly talk about their villains. And of course the style of these films really brought into the fold, taking inspiration from the Spider-Verse, which virtually changed the industry forever, allowing the goofiness of the bad guys to enter the screen and the 2D painted visuals on the 3D animation and Puss in Boots, and plus those slowed down frames like Spider-Verse. And it's one that actually virtually brought up the argument that DreamWorks was actually better than everything else. And the argument that the internet said about DreamWorks is better than everything else in their eyes just really didn't make sense to me, comparing things like Puss to Avatar 2 for some reason via Rotten Tomato ratings as a useful argument you can make, which are just two distinctly different films. Like, one is completely live action in its world built by James Cameron, and the other is an animated film that primarily is a kid's film at heart, and I just didn't get why people were just comparing one big film that made $2 billion to a film that only made like $500 million in that regard. It just doesn't make sense, but of course it reflects on the quality of what that film brought back to DreamWorks and what it actually meant. All of which to put a dent in Disney's name because of how people felt betrayed by their quality recently and the terrible themes that they proposed. Because compared to DreamWorks, they just didn't have the ability to include any villains in their sequels or even capable of having them at all in this point, where Puss literally broke that into pieces with 3 distinct villains and distinctive art styles. Where I just hate the fact that anyone just made those stupid edits comparing Disney DreamWorks in 2022 with these films and make it seem like the styles of Luca and Turning Red just paled in comparison with them, which isn't true because you didn't really get those films anyway. Because they are not bad, they are just not for you mainly, whereas of course in the case of DreamWorks, they just did what they always did, just in a new way, improving upon something that they have already done with others in the industry, creating new things that perfected that in different genres like a gang of criminals as the main heroes, or a cat from a property everyone knows too well, because once again, compared to the original Puss in Boots, this sequel actually adds to what the original Shrek films did as well, the type of story that everyone loved that blended the message with its parody of other fairy tale tropes that just worked because it goes against the grain of what we know of. And the idea of the film itself is one that is relatively simple because anyone can virtually get into about because it pertains to life itself, whether it be from relationships, mortality, and whatnot, where Disney just couldn't communicate the right ideas in films like Raya and Strange Worlds, where Encanto is being an exception in that case. And apart from that, most people think the future does look good for DreamWorks in this case, with another Kung Fu Panda film and whatnot, and how people like to meme on Ruby Gillman being the parody of The Little Mermaid because it's released during the same time frame as a live action film, and it looks like a new wacky style that people are just into now, and a continuation of the parodies of what Shrek actually did on Disney. Disney. Which of course all of these memes are just new ways for people to looking on shitting on Disney more than needs to be done to feed their petty egos like Katzenberg himself did over 20 years ago, and I think you're very petty for it. Where I just hope it promises more fun than usual with their freakish styles and whatnot, but that has yet to be seen because it kinda looks as goofy as Turning Red style, and you know the reception between both films can differ, where we can only derive with what will actually happen within the time frame where Elemental gets released by Pixar, which is relatively unique, where although that is actually predictable in its plot, I will still keep an open mind for all of them and what it will produce because I love that style. Where of course the future in DreamWorks case also holds Troll 3 during the same time frame, and eventually we will get other things like the Boss Baby 3, which I'm not happy about because for some reason DreamWorks also thinks that this is the pinnacle of their animation, like Shrek for some reason featured in their logos more heavily than I would like to imagine. The problem we will see with this is how we have to treat each individual film differently, not one that is vaguely similar as much as one is very unique from each other, where in this case we can only hope for the best of these studios, where all they need to do is just to prove that. Not one is going to drag them all down, but can set expectations high or low depending on certain situations, where most can agree that Disney is down while DreamWorks and the rest are on the up, where who knows what the future will hold for Disney at this point. Only one new property has been announced for them in Wish that comes out later this year, and the rest are mainly sequels which I have little to no confidence in comparing to DreamWorks announcing their newer films and newer sequels that are still so and so to be seen. So as you can see, most of this argument just stems from recognizing that good stories can be told if they actually focus on them and if the vision and passion are primarily there for their stories, which DreamWorks can do and never waned at all, where they just need to have the ideas that can or cannot work depending on what happens. It's just that age-old question of DreamWorks versus Disney will continue and proves if there is passion behind something, it can work, and if that really isn't there in the eyes of a soulless corporation like Disney, then it won't, like their current trajectory. So yes, the lesson that can be learned here is that the two, no matter how great their animation or something is, the most important part that matters is the story, and if you do that, you will always win that argument. And with that all said, I'm all done, so goodbye.